And we asked our panel today to kind of react to just the overview and the comparative numbers that Baruch provided and that Reason provides every year. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and they're going to talk, and then at the end of, when all three of them are done, I'll introduce each in turn. You can either stay there or come up here, although if you've got your PowerPoint, you'll have to come up here, so that kind of discerns that for you. Each of the panelists will talk, and then when they're done, then we'll do Q&A and discussion involving all three, and then you can come back to Baruch too if it raises another question. So our first panelist speaker, Julia Vitullo Martin, who was just asking the question of Baruch then, is a New York-based independent journalist and analyst who's a senior fellow at Columbia University Center for Urban Real Estate and at the Regional Plan Association. Also a former colleague of mine at the Manhattan Institute. Her work focuses on planning and development issues, and in your packet today you've got her June 2012 report of the complex worlds of New York's prevailing wage. And so without any further ado, Julia, let me get your, to the extent you want to use it here, let's get your PowerPoint up. There you are. Okay, and it's just the arrows if you want to move.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just use that if I need for reference. So EJ, you all have this report, the complex world of New York prevailing wage. Now, I actually swore after we finished this report, and we were attacked everywhere, including by the Wall Street Journal, for which I write, that I was never going to discuss prevailing wage again, and I'm only here because EJ is an old and dear friend, but I may well regret it. This topic is just one of the most contentious and undiscussed, undebated subjects in the world of construction. I mean, here we are in New York State, which is a state that came to its greatness and its wealth, as every school child learns in America, through its infrastructure investments of the 19th century, and we live in a state of crumbling infrastructure, crumbling capital plants, crumbling highways, crumbling transit, and probably most citizens in New York agree that something has to be done, and that's basically where the conversation stops. And we did this study of prevailing wage, and the unions attacked us on just about everything. And one of the things that they said was, well, labor is only one cost in construction. And of course, they're right. The truth is that in New York is too expensive on just about every factor in construction. Too expensive on environmental reviews, regulatory barriers, cost of materials, administrative costs, on everything. But the only way we're going to get out of this situation is by looking at every single factor, analyzing it as clearly and distantly and accurately as possible, and then figuring out what we should do about it. So, prevailing wage is a concept that was actually developed after the Civil War. It has a whole history with boom and bust construction, of course, and after the Civil War was one of the periods of great boom in construction in America. But what we think of as prevailing wage today really comes from the Davis-Bacon Act, Federal Act of 1931. And the idea, the important idea of Davis-Bacon was that government money for construction should not be used to undermine local markets and should not be used to undermine local labor markets. In other words, if you're going to pour government money into an area, which is what the New Deal was all about, then you need to make sure that you don't have a deleterious effect on labor markets, which is fine and good and true. And it's also, I think, correct in today's bitter debates about inequality in America and inequality of income that America's greatness is based in part on the promise of upward mobility and the promise that everybody can become successful and wealthy. And that insofar as we've got systems that prevent that, we should be looking at those systems and thinking about them and correcting them. So, all that said, Now, prevailing wage. So the long-term trend in prevailing wage has been to move from the original fairly simple idea of government construction and public works to anything that government's involved in through sponsorship or financing, not just construction. I think if the program had stayed just with construction, we'd still have problems today, but they would be much less serious than they are. So one of the things we said in the report that really upset the union was we cited Governor Cuomo's New York Works capital program. 45 agencies and authorities were projected to spend some $16 billion annually to rebuild New York. Of that, some $6 billion would be spent on labor, much of it at artificially high prevailing wages. Misallocating some $2 to $3 billion. It was that figure that the unions really objected to. Now, under state law, the way prevailing wage works in New York, and this is unique in the country, is that the wages are set by the prevailing wage that a contractor must pay is set by union contracts, and those union contracts are only supposed to be invoked when by a threshold of 30%. If 30% of an area's of a trade in a specific area, 30% are unionized, then the union contract is invoked. In practice, most of New York does not pay attention to the 30%. The state sets rates as if the entire state is unionized. So one of the effects of that is to increase the rate that gets paid under prevailing wage, because the prevailing wage is not the prevailing wage, meaning the common wage. The prevailing wage is the union rate. And the unions attacked us on this too, which was really sort of funny, because generally the construction unions are very aggressive about pointing out how successful they are at getting their rates much higher than anybody else's rates. So then when we noted that, gee, their rates are higher than anybody else's rates, and therefore they're not the common rate, they attacked us for that as being anti-union. But it's actually a very important point. The difference between what, say, a non-union carpenter is paid and a union carpenter is paid, and you'll see this if you flip through to the end of our study. We do that, we set that up for every county and every trade. We give you the BLS mean wage, the Davis-Bacon wage, and the New York State prevailing wage. You know, some of these numbers are substantial. So what we proposed was, instead of going with this very difficult, very high-cost system, New York State should consider using the BLS model, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, federal model, rather than our local model. People will still, by the way, be extremely well paid. I mean, as you know, one of the debates that always happens when you talk about making any modification in these kinds of wages is you'll get the response, oh, you want people to work at, you want people to be paid low wages and low benefits. In fact, in no way is that being discussed as, in this report, or in most of the debates on prevailing wage. The difference is not between, $10 an hour in minimum wage and $70 an hour. The difference that's being discussed in this report is the difference, say, for, let's get Albany, because probably you're all familiar with that. So, for example, a carpenter at a BLS mean wage would be paid $22 an hour, and for New York State prevailing wage is now paid 27. So we're not talking about slashing construction wages to bits. We're talking about a fairly modest difference, or a basic laborer, $18 BLS, $22 New York State prevailing wage. And even this fairly modest difference, which, you know, could result in substantial savings overall, could result in our getting far more infrastructure repaired and built. Even that fairly modest, because we're talking big overall numbers, even that very modest difference, you know, subjected this report to absolutely withering attacks. So that's where we are on prevailing wage. And the one thing that did happen around the time of this report was there'd been a tremendous push to expand the jurisdiction of prevailing wage to include affordable housing, which is, it was the Affordable Housing Association that funded this report. So to include affordable housing, that wasn't done. They were able to beat that back, but it's going to come up again. And also to expand prevailing wage to all activity by utilities. Right now, utilities are subject to prevailing wage if a government permit is pulled, but they're not subject to prevailing wage on their own property. Now, one of the things we don't say in this report, but then I feel is extremely important, is we do need a whole lot more analysis of the subject, and we're not going to get it because the unions are so intent on it not being done. Nearly all of the contracts on which prevailing wage is based are private and are not disclosed to the public, so you can't even actually see the contracts as a member of the public. We'd like to see substantially more transparency and far more analysis. And there are a couple of ways this could be done. One is the utilities. Con Ed, for example, offers, you know, what could be a beautiful study. There they are, half prevailing wage and half not prevailing wage, and they're doing essentially the same work, prevailing wage and non. So if you could ever get their cooperation, you could do a very good study, a very useful study of the differences and the effects of prevailing wage versus non-prevailing wage. And one of the things that the unions have said over and over again, and they always get quoted on this, and their economists, their union-funded economists, get quoted on this as if it's just true, and that is that prevailing wage does not cost more money. That people like us who say that it is going to cost in infrastructure another $2 to $3 billion per year, that we're just wrong because the union workers who are paid under prevailing wage are so much more productive than the unskilled workers who they say otherwise would be used, that the very productivity saves a tremendous amount of money and in fact makes up for the $2 to $3 billion that we contend is wasted now. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Julia.